It's morning, October 16th, 1962. Kennedy has just been told the news. Was the world on the brink of a nuclear holocaust? Was there something that could have been done that wasn't? These are the thoughts racing through the mind of the youngest president ever elected as he agonizes over the news. The Soviet Union has secretly shipped its missiles to Cuba, less than 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it's fast assembling strategic nuclear weapons capable of striking anywhere in America and reaching Washington in under 10 minutes. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, the bearer of the bad news, paces back and forth anxiously as President Kennedy peruses through the classified intelligence report. Photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane. The evidence is clear and unmistakable. The confrontation the world has dreaded for years has finally arrived. This, then, is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how the world reached the brink of total annihilation. Two days earlier, the United States Air Force dispatched reconnaissance specialist Major Richard Heiser on a classified mission over Cuba. In the span of 6 minutes, while flying at 72,000 feet in the U-2, Major Heiser takes 928 high-resolution photographs. CIA analysts based at the secret Miami station pore over the images, and before long they discover the white tubes nestled between the palm trees. It's the Soviet SS-4 nuclear warheads. Kennedy assembles a small group of trusted advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm. Among them, the President's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Air Force Chief General Curtis LeMay, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Maxwell Taylor. The room fills with tension. For the generals, only a full-scale invasion to purge Cuba of the brazen communists will do. Anything less, they feel, will be seen as weakness by the Soviets, and even perhaps by America's allies. Others call for diplomacy. The president is torn. Kennedy orders total secrecy to avoid national panic and prevent the Soviets from knowing that the US government has uncovered their secret. But time is ticking. Every hour that passes brings the Soviet missile installation closer to launch readiness. Across the world, in Moscow, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev is pensive, hoping his daring gamble has worked, pulling off the impossible, placing nuclear missiles in America's backyard to checkmate the United States. But why do all this? Why risk it all? To understand how we got here, the seeds of the Great Crisis had been sown a year earlier in 1961. A young revolutionary Fidel Castro had overthrown Batista, the pro-American dictator. Castro, being an ardent socialist, naturally shunned capitalist America, choosing instead to befriend the communist Soviet Union. For America, having a communist stronghold less than 90 miles away was unacceptable, and so the CIA began training 1,400 Cuban exiles, whom they would soon send to Cuba, to start an armed rebellion, believing this would trigger a popular uprising by the Cuban people, resulting in the overthrow of the communist-friendly Fidel Castro. President Eisenhower had approved the plan, but his time in the White House was up. Out he went, and in came the young Kennedy. The new president questioned the viability of the plan, but his advisers urged him to do it. arguing that President Eisenhower, his predecessor, the man who had been Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in World War II, trusted by Roosevelt and Churchill, had approved the plan. Kennedy caved in and gave the go-ahead. Unfortunately, Castro had already been tipped off. The CIA-trained Cuban exiles were doomed on arrival. The full force of Castro's army met and hammered them into surrender, but not before hundreds of them had been killed in combat. The operation was an unmitigated disaster. As the Cuban exile force floundered, the CIA and the generals urged Kennedy to intervene militarily, but the president had seen enough. Doing more would only bring the US into an illegal, unprovoked, full-scale war with Cuba. He pulled the plug, and the disastrous operation would forever be known as the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The young president had been humiliated on the world stage. Although Castro celebrated, he knew the Americans would be back, so he sought protection from the Soviet Union. Chairman Khrushchev, seeing an opportunity to place Soviet missiles closer to America, obliged. The Americans already had missiles in Turkey, the Soviets' backyard, and this was the Soviet Union's chance to get even. Khrushchev, emboldened by the Bay of Pigs debacle, was now convinced that Kennedy was a weak and inexperienced pushover. Not long after, Khrushchev and the Soviets tested Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear bomb ever detonated, 10 times more destructive than all the bombs exploded in World War II combined, including Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Khrushchev was making a statement, but he had vastly underestimated the sharp intellect and fierce competitive streak of the Kennedys. As Khrushchev and the Soviets began making plans to secretly ship their nuclear weapons to Cuba, the die had been cast, and the two superpowers were on a firm path to confrontation. Inside the West Wing, pressure mounts. Days have passed. Kennedy's advisors are still deeply divided and no closer to a solution on how to respond to the Soviets. The President invites former Secretary of State Dean Acheson to review the options and perhaps offer an alternative solution. Instead of the all-out invasion preferred by the generals, Acheson suggests a surgical airstrike to take out the missile installations before they become operational. What if the Soviets retaliate with airstrikes of their own? How would we respond to that? The President asked intently. The potential vicious cycle gave the room pause. Eventually, the idea of a naval blockade emerged as an option. This would buy both sides enough time to negotiate. Adlai Stevenson, the US ambassador to the United Nations, chimed in, suggesting the United States offer to give Guantanamo Bay to the Soviets in exchange for their withdrawal, and he continued, the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The generals eyed Stevenson hawkishly. To them, what he was suggesting was sacrilege. ExComm promptly rejected Stevenson's proposal and settled on the naval blockade. Kennedy ordered the Navy to intercept and search all Soviet vessels heading toward Cuba. Any vessel found containing offensive weapons was to be turned back, but how that would be implemented in practice remained to be seen. The press had noticed that the highest-ranking officials in the US government were daily at the White House, coming and going at the same time, and knew instinctively that something was up. The situation could only be kept secret for so long. Kennedy decided it was time to inform the nation, so on October 22, 1962, the American people huddled around radios and televisions to hear the President speak.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
As disbelief swept the nation, the American people wondered just how far the Soviet missiles could strike if launched from neighboring Cuba. The president soon revealed.
Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of traveling more than twice as far and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru.
The president ended his speech with solidarity for America's allies and a chilling warning for Khrushchev and the Soviets.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The following morning, panic buying began as fear gripped the nation. Grocery stores were overrun and gas stations ran dry. Many fled major cities seeking refuge in remote small towns, while others stared in horror as fallout shelters were stocked with supplies. Inside the White House, the Secret Service was urging Jackie Kennedy to leave, insisting her and the children move to a secure bunker. The First Lady refused. "We will stay here and live or die together with the American people," she replied. When the president was told, he quietly stared through the Oval Office window, exhausted by the enormous burden of the presidency. Unbeknownst to the president and his advisors, the situation was about to turn gravely dangerous and far more terrifying as events that would come to be known as Black Saturday were soon to unravel. It's October 24th, 1962. The first of several Soviet ships carrying more offensive weapons en route to Cuba approach the quarantine line. US Navy warships issue a warning to stop, but the Soviets ignore the warning and proceed. Kennedy then ordered the United States military to DEFCON 2. Defense Condition 2 is the second highest state of military readiness, signifying that kinetic combat is expected. Nuclear-armed US B-52 bombers would now patrol the skies 24 hours a day, with air-to-air refueling. It is the highest state of nuclear war readiness the United States has ever been in. As the Soviet ships drew closer, the White House was on edge. The blockade now had to be enforced. If the Soviet ships called America's bluff by passing through unhindered, the US would be seen as a paper tiger. If the US fired at them, the nuclear showdown would likely begin. The US Navy issues a final warning and prepares to open fire. It is textbook brinksmanship. Suddenly, one by one, the Soviet ships halt and turn back after receiving notice of a direct order from Khrushchev in Moscow. It's the closest the two superpowers have come to total nuclear war. October 27th, 1962, Black Saturday. US Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson is flying a U-2 spy plane on a reconnaissance mission over Cuba. The Soviet forces stationed in Cuba panic. Believing the U-2 was mapping every key position, they frantically radio Moscow for guidance, but no response is received. Eventually, Soviet generals Gorbuz and Grechko take matters into their own hands and authorize a strike. At 11:19 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 Soviet surface-to-air missiles are fired at the U-2. It's a direct hit. Anderson is killed instantly. The remains of the U-2 spy plane plummet out of the sky in a hail of fire. Washington is notified. The Soviets have killed an American airman. The Pentagon is furious and demands a retaliatory strike immediately. President Kennedy declined, urging calm and restraint, while General LeMay, Chief of the Air Force, was boiling with incandescent rage at the president's reluctance to retaliate. As news of the downed US plane reaches Moscow, terror gripped the Kremlin. Khrushchev had not authorized the missile strike. The Politburo was alarmed by the death of the American airman. For them, Khrushchev had lost control of the situation, and US retaliation was now at hand. As the horror sequence of events continued, the US Navy destroyer USS Beale detected a Soviet submarine beneath and fired a depth charge commanding the Soviet sub to surface and identify itself as part of enforcing the blockade. The Americans were unaware that the Soviet B-59 sub was armed with a nuclear torpedo. Inside the sub, the temperature was sweltering. Communications were cut off. The crew believed the war had already begun, and Soviet submarine captain Valentin Savitsky proposed using the nuclear torpedoes to sink the US Navy ships above. Soviet military protocol dictated that the three highest-ranking officers on board must unanimously consent before nuclear weapons could be fired. Savitsky and one other officer agreed, but second-in-command Vasily Arkhipov declined, urging caution. The world was teetering on the brink of nuclear war. Now, neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev had full control. Vasily Arkhipov was the only holdout preventing the nuclear match from being lit. Captain Savitsky tried to persuade him, but Arkhipov refused to launch nuclear torpedoes. The Joint Chiefs would not suffer the Soviets much longer. Under great pressure, Kennedy ordered 250,000 US troops to be moved from Florida and Georgia, and then airlifted to Guantanamo Bay. The force was now armed and ready for immediate deployment. As all this unfolded, Soviet ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, advised the Kremlin that a speech to the nation by Kennedy was scheduled for 3 p.m. Panic overtook the Kremlin. They feared the speech was likely the announcement of the dreaded Cuban invasion, massive airstrikes, and all-out nuclear war. The Politburo was exasperated with the situation and blamed Khrushchev. The sheer terror and uncertainty was overwhelming. Khrushchev immediately sent a conciliatory letter to Kennedy offering to remove the nuclear weapons from Cuba if the United States undertook not to invade Cuba. Later, when the Soviets learnt that the scheduled speech was only a network rebroadcast of the previous speech by Kennedy, in which he initially communicated the crisis, Khrushchev sent a second letter, sterner, demanding the removal of US missiles from Turkey as a mandatory requirement for a deal. The Kennedy administration decided to formally respond to the first letter, and privately using the back channel, agreed to the second. As Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin in secret to finalize details of the agreement, President Kennedy sent word refusing to immediately remove the missiles from Turkey to avoid unsettling the security of US allies, but agreed that the US would remove the missiles 6 months later. The president added an ultimatum. Khrushchev had 48 hours to accept the deal, and if another US plane was downed, the deal was off, and the US would immediately invade Cuba. The steely determination of the young Kennedys had finally dawned on the aged political veteran Nikita Khrushchev. Not willing to delay any further, Khrushchev accepted. October 28, 1962. The Kremlin was anxious to break the impasse, and even though communication of acceptance had been sent through official channels, the possibility of something happening before the message reached Kennedy still loomed large. So Khrushchev ordered Radio Moscow to report the deal publicly.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The world breathed a sigh of relief, and so ended the 13 days of nuclear terror. In the aftermath, Kennedy is praised for his resolve and great restraint. For Khrushchev, the celebrations are muted. The nuclear gamble proves politically expensive. Once full of charisma and casting a shadow of greatness, he would eventually be sidelined, his power brutally snatched by a rival in the Politburo. But for now, it was relief and reconciliation. Washington and Moscow established a direct hotline to improve dialogue and avoid miscalculation. A few months later, in August 1963, the two superpowers, still led by Kennedy and Khrushchev, signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, pulling the world further away from the abyss.